As I was saying, it's time that we try to make some standard generalizations about how history influenced the way we Americans do politics. I'm going to have to use the word founders. By the founders, I mean that generation of men, and I use the word deliberately, men, who existed in this country before it was a country, roughly from 1750 through the end of that century, through 1800. So when I talk about the founders, that's who I have in mind. First, I'd like to ask, what did the founders have in common? What was it that drew them together? First, all of them were the products of a British experience. They knew kings, they knew parliaments, they knew ministers, they knew law courts. They were colonists. As you would expect, what they did was to establish institutions that largely reflected or mirrored those they had known in England. A governor was, in effect, the king, appointed by the king. There were local assemblies. That was the parliament. There were local judges. And so the notion of law, rights, structure, representativeness is part of the DNA out of which our country has grown. Secondly, virtually all of the founders shared a commitment to a body of ideas that we know as, don't shoot me please, liberal. Let me explain what I mean. The founders of our nation were heirs to an intellectual tradition which we know as the Enlightenment. It began in the 1600s, the 1700s, and continued into the 1800s. The Enlightenment basically said, or those who followed the Enlightenment, basically said that virtually any question can be answered as long as we have the data, the information to explore it fully. For a person of the Enlightenment, truth was to be determined essentially by facts, by data, by backup. You've all had some exposure to the scientific method, to experimental method. That I would argue, as with only a little oversimplification, represents the essence of Enlightenment thinking. And I would argue that our founders, as a whole, were very much wedded to Enlightenment ideas of the nature of truth and how to go about it. This does not mean that they were in any way unreligious or anti-religious. In fact, I'm going to speak about that in just a moment, because religion was an extremely important part of what went on. But I do want you to understand that there was among the people who founded our nation, there was a high degree of value placed upon the willingness to engage in rational, intellectual analysis in order to solve basic problems. And I'll just leave that there for now and return to it in just a couple of minutes. Another part of the Enlightenment view of life was that human beings, all human beings, had by their very nature certain natural rights that under no circumstances could be transgressed. The nature, the source of those natural rights varied. Some said as creatures of God, that's the source of our natural rights. Others argued because we're all rational, because we can think. We're different from the animals. That is part of what, that is the source of our natural rights. Whatever the source, the concepts of rights were extremely important to the people who eventually founded the United States of America. Let me ask you this. Remember when I did my anti-number on ideology? Remember when I got all so upset about ideology? Well, this is our ideology. Insofar as Americans have an ideology, this is our ideology. One can argue it's changed. One can argue it has evolved. One can argue it does not exist now, and it certainly doesn't, as it existed in the 19th century, or the 17th century, or the 18th century. But I would point out that this is the beginning of our ideology. And we'll say more about that in just a minute. Okay, so the founders of our nation were British in their orientation, drawn together with that. They were creatures, they were products, not creatures, they were products of the Enlightenment, and I've tried to explain what that involves. I'd love to hear some comment if you have any questions about that, and maybe we could have some dialogue online about what the Enlightenment was and wasn't. We can think about that later. The third thing I'd have to say, is that what drew the founders together was a widespread, deeply felt impression that they were being denied their rights. They were being denied their rights as human beings in terms of Enlightenment expression. They were also, in their view, being denied their rights as Englishmen. I would argue, and I think the burden of historical analysis backs up the conclusion, that the colonists were fighting for their rights as Englishmen, or they were fighting because they did not have the same rights that all Englishmen had, and they deserved them. The key to this is the old saw you've heard, no taxation without representation. That was the flashpoint. King George III was fighting a bunch of wars with the French. Some of the fighting occurred on the European continent, some of it occurred in the Caribbean, and not a little of it occurred in North America, where the French had bases and had colonies of their own in what is now Canada, Vermont, Maine, Michigan, and places of that sort. And so you've heard of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was actually the battle fought